This week we're going to talk about tone, or the three A's: attitude, attachment, and angle. I'm going to start with the first two since they're linked to each other. And just to be clear what I mean by attitude, I want to sort of describe it in opposition to mood. Mood is the way in which something makes you feel, right? So the mood of a story is, say, somber or joyful or something like that. The attitude of the poem is the way in which the speaker or the subject position feels, essentially, what it is that the feeling that they're trying to express. Attitude and attachment both have to do with two things. First of all is proximity to feeling, which is to say, how close is the speaker to whatever the feeling is that they're giving to us. In other words, to what extent is it an expression of their feeling, but also to what extent is it a feeling that's accessible to us, that we are proximate to it, that we are capable of sort of feeling it. And then the second is proximity to experience. There's a kind of assumption when we're reading a poem that what we're reading is in some way or other an evocation of the experience of the speaker, but to what extent do we find ourselves in that experience? To what extent do we find an entry point through the attitude and through this sort of sense of attachment. So here's a couple of stanzas from a poem by Ruth Stone. It's actually the beginning and end of a poem called Curtains, in which she's sort of talking to the memory, the ghost, whatever, of her dead partner. And she says, "Putting up new curtains, other windows intrude, as though it is that first winter in Cambridge when you and I had just moved in. Now cold borscht alone in a bare kitchen. What does it mean if I say this years later?" And then the last part is at the very end of the poem. "I want to dig you up and say, look, it's like the time, remember, when I ran into our living room naked to get rid of that fire inspector. See what you miss by being dead?" Now you can see several things about the attitude of this poem. First of all, there is obviously a deep sense of love and loss, right, that the person is pining for, I suppose, the lost partner here. But there's also some, sarcasm may be too hard a word, but there's a biting quality to it. If you know anything about the biography of Ruth Stone, her husband actually committed suicide when they were relatively young into their marriage. It was actually in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they were living. He was teaching at Harvard. And so there is some of that kind of there's a little bit of anger, a tone of anger in the attitude of the poem. Now, here again we see the difference between the mood and the attitude. The poem is not necessarily meant to make us feel either of those things, either nostalgic or with the slight edge of whatever it is, anger, resentment, disappointment, sorrow, whatever the case may be. The attitude is simply there to give us a clear sense of where the speaker is coming from. The attachment that we make to that has to do with how well we are able to kind of relate, not necessarily to the death of a partner, but to those ambivalent feelings one has towards a loved one in any given situation. The third A is angle, and in some ways this is maybe the most useful way of thinking about tone. It's the angle at which the poem is coming at its subject. Where is it coming from? And then, the corollary question, where does it want to take us, right? So, when we say someone has an angle on something, that's sort of what we mean. Those two things, that they have a point of view, they have a perspective on it. That's part of their angle. But their angle can also be understood in, I want to avoid the sort of sinister sense of it, but a way of angling in or angling through. Sort of like an angler in the sense of a fisher person, someone that's trying to catch something and pull it in, right? They're working all the angles, that kind of a thing. And I wanted to go back to Bob Dylan for a pretty clear example of where both of these things are working, where the speaker is coming from, and where does it want to take us, with the opening couple of verses of his song, Positively 4th Street. I'm not going to try to play the music this time and run afoul of YouTube again. "You've got a lot of nerve to say you're my friend. When I was down, you just stood there grinning. You've got a lot of nerve to say you got a helping hand to lend. You just want to be on the side that's winning. You say I let you down. You know it's not like that. If you're so hurt, then why then don't you show it? You say you've lost your faith, but that's not where it's at. You have no faith to lose, and you know it. Now, there's obviously a very strong, biting sense of anger and disappointment, frustration, animus, let's just call it that in general, even hatred in these lines, right? You've got a lot of nerve. The song, the poem begins to say you're my friend, right? How dare you? So there's a clear angle in this poem. There's also a clear attitude, obviously, and maybe even a sense of attachment, since we're all kind of familiar with that feeling, I think, in some way of rejecting someone or feeling rejected by someone whom we once felt a really strong connection to. But the angle here is of the spurned lover, right? And the angle here again in the tone of the poem is to get the listener to be sympathetic with the speaker, right? So they're leveraging that anger, they're leveraging that hurt as a way of kind of getting us on side. And that's what tone does so well. The second example of this is from a poem by one of Dylan's contemporaries and somebody that I'm sure all of you have heard about. Maybe you're even familiar with this poem by Allen Ginsberg, Howl, which begins with the following lines, and this is how they're printed out in the first edition. So the lines are, they're not running into each other here. These are the line breaks. And again, back to those questions: where is it coming from? Where does it want to take us? I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night. Now, there are several things about attitude here, obviously, that there's a posture that the speaker is taking, and there's a kind of a way in which they're animating their voice, not dissimilar, by the way, to another beat poet we've looked at a couple weeks ago, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, this kind of that there's a kind of almost amphetamine energy behind this. There's also a really strong sense of cultural identification, and even if it's not clear exactly where this character is speaking from, right? But you get a sense in the voice of them, in the tone of it, which is obviously what we're talking about here, of where they're coming from. As far as angle is concerned, very specifically, someone who's rejecting hipsters, for example. This poem was written in the 1950s, where hipsterism meant something not that dissimilar from what it means now, but we were in an earlier iteration of it, burning from the ancient heavenly connection, right? That there's a sense of connection with the hipsters, but there's also a sense of dislocation from. That these are kind of a lost generation, that sort of a thing. There's an elegiac quality to this. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, right? In other words, it's like it's looking back at the past and saying, look at what's the ravages of my generation. Look what happened to them. Look what the world did to them, right? All of these things suggest something about where the poem is coming from, what position it's taking, how it angles itself into that position and holds its place within the poem, but also what it wants us to take from it, right? Where it wants to take us, where it wants us to go. And if you read the rest of the poem, you get a pretty clear sense of that. There are poems that run really kind of neatly parallel to Howl. I'm thinking of two examples, both of which we've referenced already. One is Leaves of Grass, or Song of Myself, particularly the first part of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Whitman was an enormous inspiration and influence on Ginsberg. And the other is The Wasteland, or even more sort of pointedly, since it'd be familiar with more people perhaps, is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where you see someone kind of settling quickly into the poem and saying, here is my attitude, here is my angle, now I'm going to propel you through this, right? Tone is particularly good at propelling us as readers, the audience, the consumer of the poem, however it is that you want to look at it, because it signals to us how we should read it and how we should understand it. And again, it goes back to that distinction between mood, where a poem can depress you because it's very somber, for example, and tone, where a poem can force you to kind of read it from a certain point of view, or with a certain set of assumptions about the speaker. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. Tone, obviously, then is connected to things like character and voice and all of these other things that we've been talking about.